previously, in terms of inclusive housing, we've had a process for many years that we've used in order to place students on how they identify. So on the operational side of things, when they go to apply for residence, there is an option where they can select male or female as how they identify, or they can select other. And we kind of take a more individual approach to when a student will select other, where we reach out to that student to have an individual discussion with them, just on how they identify, what space they would feel most comfortable living in, any concerns or needs that they have. And then we work with them in order to select a space for each student, just to ensure that they feel safe and comfortable. So while that was the process that we've used in previous years, at the same time, we also always had hopes of what it could look like to take another step in improving our inclusive housing, which is how we kind of came to a place where now we have a queer housing program. So the support from our campus provost advisory committee on gender and sexual diversity, as well as like support from our division that I work in, the consumer services division, and my leadership, they made it possible for us to take this next step. So now what we have is a program where any student who identifies as queer, whether it's based on their gender identity or their sexual identity, it doesn't matter, as long as they identify as queer, this is an option for them. So they can choose to live in a specific residence community with other queer identifying students. This gives them an additional community within our wider residence community. And we place our students into multiple different apartment style spaces. They're 4 bedrooms. And we typically try to group them together on one floor, so it really has like that kind of like tightly knit community feel. And how we place them is based on a few different things. So first of all, their identity, what they tell us they identify as. So for example, perhaps they identify as male, perhaps they identify as non-binary. Next, we kind of look at their preference for placement. So you might see a situation, we've had some before, where somebody maybe identifies as, example, a trans man, but he actually would prefer to be in a space that's primarily non-binary, just because that's what he's most comfortable with. So we also, of course, take that into consideration. And then the next kind of thing we just look at is compatibility between roommates. So we use a roommate placement questionnaire just to try to assess that to get like the best fit. And then we just kind of look at any other needs or expressed preferences. For example, something I've come across quite a few times, and it seems to be more and more frequent the longer we have our program, is that a student might not be openly out as queer, and they want to live with other non-openly queer students or students who aren't out yet. So that's also something like we would look at too. So it's kind of like a number of different things. But the biggest piece is that we work with each student kind of individually to place them. So we reach out to each person once they apply for residence if they express their gender as other. And we'll have these conversations with each student individually. Alternatively, for students who, I think it was Derek, you mentioned like maybe they're applying to residence with a parent or something, and they're maybe not out and they don't want to select other. That's definitely something we've come across. I've actually been on a phone call with a student at some point who emailed me and said they were interested in queer housing. And on the phone, they were saying that they identified as female, but then they sent me another email after saying, sorry, my mom was with me. I don't actually identify that way. Which is why I think like having an individual conversation and really like building those like individual connections has been really key for us anyways. But now we're at kind of a place where we work with every student in the program individually throughout the year, kind of give them whatever support they express that they need. And this year has definitely looked a little bit different due to COVID, but hopefully we'll get back to things for next year.
Awesome. So do we all want I don't know what just happened to the voice coming out of my mouth. Yeah, do we want to get into the second question? So for context for all the participants, the second question I posed to the panelists was kind of the dream of what inclusive housing at their institution could look
like. I can start again. Yeah, and thanks, William and Annie, for sharing what's happening at your institution. I think for us, like one thing that I've had conversations about this week and what seems hopefully like feasible for us in the next little bit is like students being able to self-select the community that works best for them and to not have to kind of go through the barrier of having to talk with a professional staff member about like what their individual situation is, because it's, you know, for us it is a barrier. It's not like the person is like a cute queer housing coordinator like youth ask, so it, you know, can definitely seem like a little bit more of a barrier when you have someone whose title is just like student support manager or admissions coordinator as well. So yeah, trying to get out of that system, I guess, is like something that seems feasible for us in the next little bit, is students just being able to self-select like what type of community works best for them and what type of washroom would they feel comfortable and safe using, and what does that community look like. For more like architectural of a vision of UVic, we have a broad amount of like older buildings with your traditional like binary washrooms, but we also have a lot of our newer buildings which are going into gender neutral washrooms and full stalls with everything in one. So simultaneously we are stuck in the past, but also like moving forward very much in the future with buildings that are coming up January and following fall 2022. So yeah, exciting, or sorry, fall 2022 and then January 2023. Weird to think about time and years right now. I think a thing that also I'm hoping is like a dream and hoping is also feasible as well is better integration of like the software that we use. So not to put like StarRes on blast, but it's not great if your legal name is not your like the name that you go by, and often referred to as your dead name. So yeah, getting a better like software integration of that, and you know, getting the tech bros of Silicon Valley to really play ball with that, hopefully, is a thing that we can be doing as well. One thing we're working on right now, and I like literally had a meeting in the last hour of was talking about like how can we get the washrooms that are in our heritage buildings, if you will, that are binary gendered, like how can we make those gender neutral, and is there a way we can do that faster than the timeline given? Yeah, one thing that we're doing, and I think again, dream thing, is one thing that we have here at UVic is we have what's called living learning communities. So students will have to essentially apply to live there, and it's typically more academic focused. So examples of what we currently have is something like a health and wellness community, and something like a global citizenship community, and working towards, not working towards, rather, we already have like a science community. So more academic based stuff, but we're also getting into more other communities with our new buildings going up. So we have an Indigenous living learning community launching. We also have a French living learning community that is launching with our new buildings, which is exciting. So I think a dream would be, how do we get like our program QVic, which is programming by and for queer students, can we get that into a living learning community? Can we have a queer living learning community similar to kind of what USASC is doing? And can we have, you know, like queer student leaders living in those communities and leading and educating on queer history as well? So very much a dream. also one thing is like, you know, when we're talking about diversity and inclusive housing, like, can we also go beyond like sexuality and gender identity? And can we start thinking more about how we're intentionally placing folks who are differently abled or racialized folks, are they feeling safe and empowered and celebrated in their communities? And also like neurodiversity is something we're starting to think about as well. So all on the dream spectrum of stuff. Yeah.
Do we want to do the same order, or do you want to switch it up, Annie?
Let's go with the same order.
Okay, great, perfect. Yeah, so in terms of, you know, like a pie in the sky, perfect world, this is my dream. I have no idea. And I think that that is okay, because as much as it's sad, I'm not a student anymore, and so I don't have that perspective in the same way. And so I am, you know, taking courses, but I'm a part-time student through Athabasca, so obviously a very different ballgame than what my students are experiencing. And so, you know, it's kind of, if you're looking for concrete ideas, I apologize, this isn't the answer for you, but I do, you know, really believe in the fact that our students are pretty in tune with what they need, and also with the trends and what their peers need in terms of, you know, generational trends that already I'm starting to feel disconnected from, even being a new professional. And so it's a bit of a wake-up call, and I think a good reminder for all of us that doing the research is important, and these kinds of conversations are really important. And also, in addition to that, I think the most important is the direct perspective of the students. So once we sort of get past for Concordia our initial sort of structural challenges and some things that we've been talking about in already, I don't think it'll be me or anyone else who's on our payroll necessarily who designs the system. I really hope it's the students who design the system. And then we just sort of cap it based on what money we have. But really, I want the vision to be almost none of my creation, because I don't think that that's where the best information is going to come from and where the best student service is going to come from. But that's my hot take on the pie in the sky.
I definitely agree with a lot of what you're saying, William. I'm definitely on the same page there, as thinking like it's hard to give like a specific concrete answer for this, but something we really feel passionately about at USask is definitely kind of like making the inclusive housing based on what the students are telling us what they need, as opposed to what we think or assume they might need, because it can actually be quite different. So that's also just as another piece, that's something else we do with our students in our queer housing program at USask is we let them know when they join queer housing that like part of it is that we want to build the program and change it to meet their needs. So we will like reach out to them for feedback or ask them like what they're missing, things like that, just to kind of like hit every area, just as a side piece. But so now that we have a specific queer housing community and residence, the dream is kind of just to continue to grow it and improve it, just so it can better meet the needs of the students living in it, and to continue learning about the challenges that face everybody in the queer community, just so that we can better support the community as a whole, especially students living in residence, not just in the queer housing community. So one thing that we're kind of doing is the next step, which is like helping along the lines of getting to like the dream, is that we're in the process of opening up our queer housing lounge. So although it is called the Queer Housing Lounge, it's going to be a lounge in residence that's open and available to any student who identifies as queer, part of the queer community. So this is something I'm really excited about personally, because it can help those who are living in queer housing connect with like other queer identifying students throughout residence. And it also kind of gives us a bit of an in to help support other students who identify in queer, who don't live in queer housing, who maybe we don't know about, just in whatever way they may need. So it was supposed to open up this past fall, but as we all know, COVID has changed some things. So now it'll open up hopefully fall 2021. but the lounge is going to be a space that kind of offers a safe space, a comfortable atmosphere for any queer student to connect with other queer students. They can study, socialize. We're also going to have a queer library section of the lounge where they can borrow content from it. And something else we really want to do is we're planning to have just people such as like myself, the queer housing coordinator, or other supports that we have, like our counselor in residence, kind of hold office hours in the lounge and on a rotating basis, so that students can also stop by if they have questions, concerns, need support, just need to chat with someone, just want to say hi, whatever it is. So that's another way that we're hoping to kind of help identify the needs and meet those needs. So since this is already in the works, this is kind of like the most kind of like the newer dream that we're having, the newer part of the dream, and the one that will happen probably the soonest. But other than that, the overall kind of dream for queer housing is just for it to be something that any queer student who maybe previously wasn't comfortable living in a traditional residence environment. And I've heard a lot about that, and that makes sense. Hopefully to get it to a place where any of those students would feel comfortable coming to live in residence or in queer housing, and just to provide them with a positive experience in residence and give them whatever support they express that they want or need. So that's kind of just ultimately the real goal. Derek, you also mentioned some troubles with Banner, which is also interesting. We have that challenge too, where it might switch from a person's name, like a preferred name or the name that they go by, back to maybe their dead name or something else, just because that's technically their legal name. So another part of my dream would be to see that problem disappear as well. That's also something we're working on at USask on kind of like a wider scale across campus. A member of our Provost Advisory Committee on Gender and Sexual Diversity, Simone Horowitz, she's incredible, and that's something she is currently working on fixing. So I also hope to see that change very soon as well.
Amazing. Okay, so moving on to kind of the last question I posed to you, which is, I mean, you've already been segueing that way with the past few things you said, but challenges you may have faced with implementation of gender inclusive or queer housing practices, or foresee facing with any future steps.
Yeah, I feel like, again, like Sarah said, kind of been segueing there. I think the biggest thing that I'm seeing right now is like actualizing steps, because there's so many different like departments that need to be involved for something like, how do you change a restroom that was built in like the 60s and knocked down urinals and et cetera, et cetera. How many people need to be involved there, and what's happening around that. So actually I think steps, and also like the timeline, which ties into like systemic and institutional barriers. And I think the big one that I'm struggling with right now is like, and I'm sure a lot of other institutions are also struggling with right now, is like, because of COVID, like work like this gets pushed down the priority list, because like so often this year we've just been trying to get by and provide the service of a residence experience for the students that are there. And because we don't know what that looks like a lot of the time in terms of numbers, and because we're operating at like a deficit, as I'm sure a lot of other residence programs are as well, like it gets pushed down the list of priorities because it costs money to do this work as well. So those are like the immediate challenges beyond just like the timeline and stuff. Going back to the banner thing, like that's multiple departments that need to be involved to make that a process that feels less archaic and feels safe for students, frankly, and stuff like that. But you know, that's tied to the larger legal system, and there's so many other things in this society that are tied to that as well. So big barriers, big bads, if you will. yeah, and I think for us as a department at UVic, like it doesn't quite live with one person, this project, which I think is a thing that is a double-edged sword, in that when we get a lot of people involved, it's helpful because we can all kind of, I guess, virtually hold hands at this point and work together. But if one person slips, or if the portfolio of everyone gets really busy, then who does that live with ultimately when it doesn't live with one person as well? So yeah, lots of growth to be done here. Again, only been here for 6 months, but really trying. And yeah, I think I echo kind of like what William and Annie are saying in regards to like the student experience as well. And that's really something that we need to be championing as well. And also like starting to ask the question, like, students are doing a lot of emotional and sometimes even like physical labor around doing this, and are we compensating them for their time and stuff like that? And are there ways that, you know, that it doesn't feel like an empty gesture or something like that? Because a lot of the times with students as well, like that advocacy work is exhausting, and it's not something that they should be having to do on top of like just like being a student and being a human. So yeah, I will leave there.
Awesome. So yeah, I'm glad we've been segueing. We're so natural. At Concordia, I would say in terms of, you know, the biggest limitations right now, I'm really relating to the piece about old buildings and how the, you know, actual capital and infrastructure pieces can be almost an insurmountable barrier sometimes. I know for my team, we've had some tough conversations and tried and talked with contractors and quoters to see how we could potentially change some of our bathrooms in particular that just aren't set up for, I guess, what one would think would be gender inclusive. And the costs sometimes are just like exorbitant to the point where we're willing to do a lot to make this work, but we can't bankrupt ourselves because then we won't exist at all. So that's really tricky. And so I would say, yeah, that I really relate to the structure pieces. And then as well, I think I wanted to note that I misspoke earlier, which was just like a Freudian slip, I guess, or a verbal typo, I'll call it. For our applications, students can choose male, female, or gender diverse. The other option is gender diverse, not prefer not to disclose. So that was a bad verbal typo. I take it back. And so that, I think, is a starting point though for us, because eventually what we use that data for is to say, like, okay, if a student selects gender diverse, at this point, what the conversation has to be is, okay, for you, would you rather live on a floor that is for male students or female students? And so we can let students say, I am gender diverse, but then ultimately, they have to pick one or the other in terms of who they want to live with. And so that's, again, just sort of a thing that we're working on technologically, which is, again, tricky sometimes, but it's helpful that folks here at Concordia are great. And that's our main strength. I mean, we're coming up against some real issues in terms of structure, technology, these things we're talking about. But I haven't felt at all, and this is true and also I think rare, that I'm fighting against. I think as an institution, we're fighting against barriers, not me trying to convince other people at the institution that this is a problem. And so that's something that I'm very, very privileged at, is that when I say to our senior administrators, like, this is a problem, their immediate response is like, absolutely it is. And I know that that can sometimes be rare, hopefully less rare, and I think it's becoming less rare, but that's a real strength that I have at Concordia, some really meaningful supports and really dedicated champions of the cause. So I'm a one-person housing operation, but similar to what other folks are saying, like, I'm not the only one championing this cause. So that's a real strength for me at Q, and will be important moving forward.
So in terms of kind of some of the challenges and barriers that I've faced in regards to our current queer housing program, I'll start with some of the smaller ones. Just kind of getting things up and running was one of it. It was a lot of littler challenges combined, but we got kind of the go ahead to start our program in the summer, and then we only had a couple months to plan the program, design it, set it up, figure out like all the logistics, the actual spaces, things like that, communicate with groups on campus, advertise everything. So kind of just going through those things the first time was challenging. However, having our program be in its second year now, no longer our pilot year, things are a lot easier now that it's set up. And we've done everything once kind of, so that's been great. So some of the larger scale problems and barriers that I've come across is just, first of all, kind of the financial piece, specifically for the students who are interested in living in queer housing, but they cannot afford it because maybe there's a place off campus that has cheaper housing, or even just a different residence building that they're living in for financial reasons because it costs a bit less. Because currently queer housing is specific to one residence area. So that's one of the barriers for sure that I've seen. And we also get a lot of students who are interested in queer housing that have diverse backgrounds. So we've had students who are coming into queer housing from being homeless, and they have challenging financial situations. So helping them figure out their finances and connect them to people who can help them figure it out has been challenging, because at the end of the day, there's only so much they can do and there's only so much we can do in order to make ends meet there. So that has been a difficult barrier, and I'm currently trying to figure out ways I can overcome that. My thoughts right now, I haven't gone too far with it yet, but my thoughts are hopefully looking for maybe like some grants or something, or government funding, something along those lines throughout the country that I can apply to, or have the students apply to, or something to kind of help with the cost of housing. So maybe if a student has financial challenges, but they want to live in queer housing, or they need to get out of like an unsafe housing situation, we can use maybe some of those funds or something to kind of like subsidize the cost of their housing. So that's currently one of the challenges I'm looking at. And just to kind of like demonstrate it, I actually received an email from a queer housing student. And I've like redacted the information and stuff. I will just take a second to pull that up. So it says, "Hi, Annie. I am hoping to live in queer housing for the upcoming year, but due to the increase in rent, I am considering looking at other housing options. Unfortunately, I may have to consider this as the rent is potentially increasing. Would you be able to speak to this, or is there anything else that we can do to change this? I have loved living in queer housing, and it has been such a welcoming program, and I would love to be around next year to help welcome new students, but I'm not sure if I can at this time." So it's just seeing things like that where the student wants to stay in queer housing and also wants to help other students who are joining queer housing, which is great, but potentially not being able to just because of financial barriers. That's something that needs to change. I'm not sure how yet. So that's kind of one of the bigger ones. And then another one is just figuring out how to better support students who are not out to their family or not openly out. There's a lot of considerations for these student situations that I hadn't really considered prior to starting queer housing. So for example, what will move-ins look like? A lot of students have their families help them with move-ins, but if they're not out, how are you going to navigate them moving into a space with other students who might be openly out, who might want to put like a pride flag on the door, who might mention that they're a part of queer housing? There's a lot of considerations with that. So there's a lot of like liaising. I always liaise with my student staff, my RAs who I oversee, and let them know when a student is in this situation. I also let the student know, of course, that everything like their identity will be kept confidential, but we are going to let our staff know just to ensure that we can keep things that way and support them in whatever they're comfortable with. So letting the student staff know, letting the operational staff know, in case someone like gives them a call with a question about it, things like that. And then also navigating the roommates. So helping the student to have that discussion with the roommates, or having it with the roommates on their behalf if they prefer that, about like, what are you going to do when maybe one of the other roommates' families comes over and you have a lot of like pride decor up in your apartment, but your one roommate isn't out. What are you going to do? So situations like this, thankfully all the students have been awesome for situations like this. And like when something like that happens, they'll like quickly do like a round of the apartment, take things down, like put them away. They've just been great with that, but it's still a barrier for the student who's not out, that I would prefer not to be there for them. So just kind of navigating these pieces. Also, I've seen a lot where students have reached out to me and said, I'm interested in living queer housing, but I'm not out yet. Is it possible maybe to just like attend some of the programming, but not live in queer housing? So also figuring out how to integrate those students into the program more so that they feel really connected, but at the same time, kind of protecting them from what they're not comfortable with at the moment. So those are kind of the two bigger pieces for challenges for me anyways at the U of S that I've seen.
I am just like blown away by how much I am learning right now. This is fantastic. Thank you so much to the three of you for sharing all of your knowledge on all things inclusive housing. Yeah, so we are now going to open up the floor for questions. I see we already have some in the Q&A, which is awesome. So yeah, if you have a specific question for one of the panelists, or just kind of posing something to the group as a whole, those are all totally good. If you want to ask your question verbally, feel free to raise your hand, and Jessica, with all of her powers, will, oh, she just messaged about it. Raise your hand and Jessica will unmute you so that you can ask your question. In addition, like if you want to add on to something, if somebody asks a question, there was some discussion and you want to add on, feel free to again raise your hand and Jessica can unmute you. Just hoping to get through this discussion in an organized fashion virtually. So I'm going to go ahead and start going through some of the questions that are in the Q&A. So the first one I'm going to pose to the panelists is, what are your thoughts on safe space campaigns on campus?
I can start. So, I mean, I think that this is a question that reflects a very big and I think emotionally charged conversation that's happening, you know, everywhere, but in North America right now as a whole, of what does freedom, you know, academic freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, what do these things actually mean? And so, I mean, two thoughts that come to mind for me. I've heard before at a couple different institutions that they are using the term, instead of safe space, safer space, or brave space, I've heard before as well, to reflect that, you know, unfortunately, we can't ever guarantee safety, but how can we, you know, present ideas in a way that is safer and allows for authenticity? I can't speak to our campus-wide policy on sort of academic freedom and freedom of expression and all those things. I'm sure it's available on our website if you're interested in reading it, but I can tell you, you know, in residence, if you know, an RA came to me with a program and we were unsure if it would be hurtful or targeting to certain students, it's kind of tricky, but I think in general, sometimes the conversation becomes more nuanced than it needs to be. Like at the end of the day, if your presentation is that queer people should not live in housing, then you're just like hateful. So we can call it academic freedom, but you're just kind of a jerk. So as long as your presentation isn't hateful or discriminatory, then we really shouldn't have to have that big of a conversation in general. And usually it's pretty obvious whether or not something if whether or not someone's coming from a good place or from a hateful place. There's lots of different language and flowers that folks can use to sort of disguise. But at the end of the day, you know, a presentation about options for gender inclusive housing versus protecting the binary of gendered housing, protecting safe spaces for cis students, like that's really great, but we want to make sure that the lens isn't hateful. The lens is authentic, and academic freedom is not freedom to criticize whether or not someone has the right to exist. And so, I mean, I think we all acknowledge that that's a debate that's going on right now, and I could rant probably forever, but at the end of the day, if you're hateful, I have no time for you. If you're not hateful, welcome to our community.
I think that was a great answer. Did any of the other panelists want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I've just been like rereading the question and thinking. Again, like I also can't really speak to what is our like campus-wide policy following kind of like academic freedom discussions, and let's put that in air quotes because like ew. Yeah, it just takes me back to like UBC and Jordan Peterson and that whole thing. So to my knowledge, UBC hasn't invited Jordan Peterson to speak EA, but like still part of like a larger like campus conversation of like whose voices are we centering and who are we giving a platform to and stuff like that. I think a thing we're struggling with in terms of like safe spaces and stuff like that is we did have anti-trans protesters here in the last month, but they were across the street, so they are on like public land and they're not on university land. So even though like police and campus security were called, like they don't fall under our jurisdiction when they're in a spot like that. So they can be really sneaky and stuff like that. But also there was 3 of them, and when you call so much attention to them, they're like, ah, yes, it's working. So weird space there. I've been thinking a lot about safe spaces in kind of like last week I went to a really interesting webinar at Northwest Akuo, if anyone else had the privilege of attending, but Janie Sacco, who works at St. Martin's University in Washington, had a really good talk on kind of like a lot of what we do in university spaces is education work, and we are educating students and we're doing work on affinity, and the work that we do around those things can be made safer by like limiting who is allowed in those spaces and what kind of conversations are being held and what space is being held. But when we're doing work around action and stuff like that, we have to be upfront with our students to say like, this is not going to be a safe space. You don't really know what you're going to encounter, and it will be probably really emotionally charged work when you're doing that, because it is action based, and that really gets messy and gets people involved emotionally. So it's not going to be safe. And yeah, I think we're getting better at understanding like what is the difference between that as well, because I think safe space was such a buzzword years ago, and it was like, oh, we're just trying to create this. But I think we've also gotten better at realizing there are just certain spaces that can't be safe, and we need to prepare people for that instead of you know, because that's unfortunately the world that we're living in.
Okay, so I'm gonna go on to the next question. They're disappearing on the Q&A. Okay, so this person doesn't have much experience with LLCs. They seem to have a lot of advantages. So this question is basically, how do we think that grouping up affects the community as a whole? Do you think there are drawbacks to that? And how do you maintain the bridge between the students in queer housing spaces and the broader living spaces? So this individual's institution unintentionally had international floors, and they found that it developed good connection within those residents, but maybe not very much like bridging between other communities.
So I can speak about this a little bit first from my perspective. So that's definitely a concern that we had when we were in the process of creating queer housing, was that we of course, want to create a space for any queer identifying students where they can live with each other if they would like, and build their own community. But we are still trying to ensure that they're integrated with the wider community as well, because that is important. We don't want them to feel like separate or isolated, or like we're purposely trying to disconnect them or anything like that. The intention is for them to build two communities by being in queer housing: one, the wider residence community, and two, their queer housing community. Sometimes students who live in queer housing, they have just chosen to live there just because it's a space where they feel safe and comfortable. However, maybe their community is with other students who live elsewhere in residence, and they don't spend a lot of time with the other queer housing students. That's fine. It's really, the program is designed to hopefully meet whatever each individual person needs. So we have those situations. That's fine. Sometimes people prefer to just make friends with the people inside of queer housing, and that's really what they were looking for, was connection with other queer people, which is also great. So it first of all kind of depends on like what the person wants, but we really encourage the students who live in queer housing to go out to other programming throughout the rest of residence as well. We also have other RAs who are not our specifically queer housing, or specifically chosen, queer housing RA, drop by the queer housing specific programs so that they can kind of like introduce themselves, get to know the students a little bit more, just to make it a little bit easier for the students to branch out outside of the queer housing community if they wish. But it's definitely something that's always kind of in my mind, is how to find like a nice balance of making the queer housing community tightly knit, but also ensuring that they are connected with like the rest of the community as well.
Awesome, thank you, Annie. Okay, so another question has popped up. So what kinds of LGBTQ2+ programming and or events do you host or support on your campuses? And if money or resources were not a limitation, what would be your dream?
Having a good think on that again, but yeah, I think if folks have joined later, what QVIC does, which is programming like by and for queer students, like it's largely been around like sexual health education and more passive based education, and now kind of we're getting into more of like activism work, and supporting activism as programming is, I think, a really good thing. That we also like need to be thinking more about when we're doing programming, because sometimes programming is activism. And yeah, I think that's a thing that I've been thinking about recently as well. I think if money or resources was not a limitation, yeah, I think like putting money into the activism that we're doing would be so huge. Like I think again, like the restroom spaces that we're up against right now, because they're so costly, like that would be a total dream. And being able to like pay external facilitators to do like campus-wide training, and to really, you know, like put our money where our mouth is, and not make these like this like add-on kind of optional experience, and to build it into more of the campus culture, and to again like put money into that would be so huge. Just to pay people for their emotional labor in general would also be a thing. So yeah.
In terms of some of the programming that we host throughout queer housing, it's kind of varied. Again, we take a very individual kind of approach. So in terms of planning programs, we may have like the RA do a round and chat with each of the students and see kind of like what they want to see, what they're missing, what some of their interests are. And then some of our programs will be planned that way. Some of our programs will also be planned just based around kind of like educating the students on supports, both on campus and in the community. So for example, like one of our programs that we had last year was a learn to make sushi night, where it was a blast. And we had somebody from our city's local like queer center, so out Saskatoon. They've got a whole bunch of awesome staff there who are trained to give like specific trainings, and trained on supporting people. They hold a lot of events and things like that. They're really great. We had a member from out Saskatoon come and host the Learn How to Make Sushi Night. So this person, they taught the students how to like make their own sushi. The students got to hang out with each other and stuff, chat. But they also got to connect with someone from out Saskatoon and form that connection so that they could be connected to those resources, which was kind of like the main goal of the program and the main hope. So that's an example kind of the programming that we currently do. We also kind of base it on like trends and needs that we see in general. So if, for example, the students in queer housing have been like they've been having a lot of roommate challenges or something like that, we might just do a program like centered around kind of like living with others and like supports you can get with that, how to make things like work, have the RA support them. So kind of a variety of different things. We also have a really awesome Pride Center on campus too. And they have a lot of programming. They also provide trainings and stuff like that. So we usually get someone from the Pride Center or out Saskatoon or both to actually train our student staff during like their summer training program before they get started through the year. But they also have a lot of awesome resources. So our RAs sometimes will go to them as well, or we might go to them to get the information or programming things from them. But they also host a lot of things individually on the rest of campus as well. They provide a lot of like events. Oh, and the other part I forgot. If money was not like an issue or anything, or finances were not a problem, I think something I would really like to see is just, I think it was maybe William who mentioned bringing other people in to speak with like the students or provide that programming. Just because a lot of times like bringing someone from like externally, if they're not through just like out Saskatoon or through our campus Pride Center, it's going to be relatively costly. So getting those opportunities, I think, would be incredible. Also, maybe connecting them with like some sort of other group. For example, I know there's a camp called Camp Firefly who hosts like queer youth during the summer. If there was some way we could potentially like connect with them, that would be amazing. That's kind of like been on my mind too. So just kind of things along those lines.
Awesome, thank you so much. I see that Jessica has her hand raised. Jessica, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. It is related to the question that you folks just answered and a little bit of the other questions that are coming up. But I'm wondering if you can speak to the initiatives that you have in residence that are for the whole community, not just specifically for queer housing, to work on building safer spaces and more of a social justice focus. And then what are some of the visual cues that you use in your inclusive spaces that are, a reminder of our obligations to one another? And thirdly, what kind of markers do your staff use to show that they are allies, or just to demonstrate something more visual and tangible that people know that those are safe people to talk to?
I can share that. So I'm trying to remember all the different pieces of all these great questions you just had, Jessica. In terms of, the programming targeted towards students as a whole, as part of residence orientation, they participate in sexual violence prevention and bystander intervention. And so bystander intervention is obviously something that is a super transferable skill to all different kinds of things, which is great. And so that is a piece that's helpful. And then diversity, equity, inclusion, these wonderful pieces that we're all working on is a big sort of building block for student staff training at Concordia. And I'm sure it's similar for other folks as well. That's a really important piece. And so there's no sort of like, my staff don't necessarily like wear, well, they might, but they're not like required to wear like a pin or something like that they carry around, like maybe on their like outfit or sorry, uniform or anything like that. I think for us, it's more of just like a cultural piece of the training. And then also it's something that, first community meeting, my staff will say really clearly to their communities what the expectation is around equity, inclusion, those types of things. So it sort of sets the tone that like, A, I'm willing to talk about this, and B, I'd like for us to talk about this, and C, only if we're going to do it in a really respectful and constructive way. So I would say visually there isn't a whole lot that we're doing right now. But in terms of sort of community building and setting the tone and expectations, my staff are fairly well trained, and certainly not just by me, by campus and community partners as well. And setting the tone with the community is really important for us.
Yeah, going off of that, I think super similar at UVic in terms of like what we have is like mandatory for students is again like bystander training and sexualized violence prevention training, and so that's all stuff there. And then I think again super similar, but training for our students in terms of like anti-racism resources, and we did a really not new but a new facilitator rather was brought in on gender diversity in residence through Kingsley Strudwick at Ambit Gender Diversity recently, which was really, I think, enlightening for a lot of our staff. So I feel like in student affairs, we've been throwing around the term like, oh, this is so relevant right now. And that's not quite true. It's always been relevant. I think it's just we've realized as like a department and hopefully as like a movement that like it needs to enter the collective kind of like subconscious, and it needs to be constantly on our minds and constantly relevant. I think we form kind of like what is the agenda for the first community meeting, and to build in stuff like pronouns if the student's feeling comfortable with sharing that, but building that in as much as possible. Similarly, we don't have any sort of like markers that a staff member will wear, but professional staff do sometimes have like stickers on their door and stuff like that. But again, I think the problem with something like this is it largely falls again on the individual to continue to push themselves to do better, and sometimes the baseline is not enough. So yeah, I really appreciate this question and like what kind of thoughts it's brought up for me as well.
William and Derek have spoken to kind of some of the things that we do as well, so I won't repeat those. But in general, we kind of come at making residents like a safer space from a lot of different angles. So whether that's through just things like posters in our residents handbook, through like our student staff, through the professional staff, through the programming that we run, we try to incorporate things like making sure like people are being respectful and inclusive of others. So that's kind of, it's tricky to answer just because there's so many different ways. But I would say last year, like something like having queer housing in the area of residence that I worked in, the RAs were incredibly passionate about it. And we also spoke about it in their training. And something that we did with everybody last year in a regular non-COVID year was that everybody was given like a pride flag, not like a huge one, just like one, like kind of like that. And each of them either put it on their own door or on like their bulletin board, which is right next to their door, just to kind of set that tone for anybody who enters the floor, or enters the building. You will like see the pride flags, and hopefully people will understand that this is like an inclusive space. And the goal is for it to, of course, be safe and inclusive. Something else is, again, I think like stickers was mentioned too. That's also something sometimes people will do. But we also take an educational approach to things. So if there is ever a concern, for example, like last year, I think one of the pride flags went missing from one of the people's doors, and we were concerned that that was potentially something that was done purposefully. And we were able to like look into it and determine what happened. Thankfully, it turns out somebody just took it, I think, because they wanted it, which is much better than another option. But whenever something actually does happen, we will follow up with everybody involved. So we'll follow up with anyone who may have been impacted negatively. And we will ensure that we do everything in our power to make sure they are feeling comfortable and safe. So providing them with supports, resources. If they're not feeling safe in a certain space, we can move them. It's no problem, whatever kind of we can do to support them. But we also take an educational approach with the person who has caused any harm, if that is the situation. So we will do individual work with them, and often we'll maybe have them do some sort of like research or some sort of like reflection or something, just to kind of reflect on like the harm they've done and really understand the impact. And if there's any issues with like language that was being used or something along those lines, we'll also work with them to try and educate them on that piece as well. However, of course, there can only be so much room for education. And if the harm was like intentional or if it was like repeated or something like that, we do not tolerate anything like that in residence. So we would probably be taking a different approach then. But kind of just like education and getting it in as many ways as possible is probably like the biggest thing. We're always looking for new ways. There's always ways everybody can improve. So we're just kind of continually trying to look at things and assess them and assess kind of what we can do better.
Awesome. So I saw one more question pop up. How connected are you with your institution's departments for diversity, equity, inclusion, so things like pride centers and stuff, when it comes to matters of inclusive housing and or general queer-friendly education and events?
I can start. My answer will be quick. We don't have a department for this on campus, so there's no one to interact with necessarily. Our student life and learning department, which is technically my department as well, I'm a unit within that. These are conversations that we have as a team, and then our senior members, so our VP student life and learning and director, are sort of the spearheads on that and work super closely with our GSA equivalent. That's not the right terminology, but equivalent to that. And so that's where I get most of my consultation and information from.
So for myself, I take usually like an approach of ideally getting like some resources and information from either our campus Pride Center or out Saskatoon. But something we also do is like we have, like I mentioned, somebody from either or both of those places come in and train our student staff on inclusivity, and like they will give them like pamphlets and information, things like that. So it's typically I'm not the main person planning programming. It's a little bit different sometimes with queer housing, I will sometimes specifically plan their programming, but programming in general related to like queer issues, queer housing, things like that. The RAs will also take a large part in it. So they will also reach out to those resources. We really promote getting in touch with like campus and community partners when they do programming. So they're already kind of like trained to get that information too. But just to ensure everything is fine, we also have another kind of step. So once they've decided what they want to do with their programming and the information and everything, they have to run it by a more experienced student staff member who then runs it by a professional staff member, just to make sure everything is like correct. There's not any issues with the information that they're providing. So that's kind of something that we do there. But I would love to even get more connected with out Saskatoon in particular. We work a bit more often with the Pride Center on campus. They're also fantastic with referring students who are looking for housing who are queer to queer housing and getting in touch with us. So I'm in touch more with them than our community resource out Saskatoon, but they're incredible and they have a whole host of things. So our staff, the professional staff and stuff, will also often reach out to them for like trainings and things as well. I think they're actually running a training today, maybe. They're great, but there's always room to kind of connect with them more.
Yeah, similarly, I think also looking for more ways to kind of connect more with different campus resources. I think how connected we are in terms of like a housing department to, you know, folks that work directly with diversity and equity and inclusion, as was brought up in the question, is definitely something we're connected to. I think what I've done in my work with QVIC is tried to like ask them like, who do you need me potentially to connect you to? And because I'm rather new to the institution, it's like, oh, we already have those relationships. I'm already talking to this person. So me myself at like the micro level, like not super connected and still trying to figure out how certain things are working. But at the macro level, I think we have a lot of those connections that are already built, which is great. And I think one thing that I'm really excited for and is a great person to have on our side is like the chair of transgender studies at UVic, who's connected with our QVic program. So to integrate kind of like that academia side into that as well, so that we're also, you know, we're taking the people who are in power in the academic side as well and connecting them with the people who do the on the ground work in housing is, I think, also super important, and connecting it to what is relevant and timely theory and what is the most like up to date and trauma centered like work that we have in academia as well.
Forgot to unmute myself. Okay, so it looks like we've reached the end of our session. So I just want to thank all of the attendees for coming and asking questions. That's amazing. I also would like to give a huge thank you to Annie, Derek, and William for being a part of the panel. Your knowledge and your transparency around like challenges you've faced have both been so helpful. And I know that I personally have appreciated it a lot. I'm definitely taking a lot away from this conversation about like things that I can do moving forwards. So yeah, just thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. So yeah, I hope all of the attendees and panelists as well have an amazing rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us. Much appreciated. This was a very informative event.